Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Today we're going to talk about how science and religion have finally come to a point where they're coming back together again in the most unique way. We've tried to use both to use as a barometer and even a pathway to find out what is the meaning of life, why are we here, and what are we supposed to do. Some of us take some of the most interesting journeys when it comes to that. You could be down in South America and perhaps partaking in an ayahuasca ceremony, or you might be fasting on the edge of the Grand Canyon. Perhaps you might find those answers as you trek across the desert in between the temples of Egypt and the pyramids. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who has discovered through a series of incidents something known as the Genesis Code. That's right, when most people hear about Genesis, we're talking about Genesis in the book of Genesis in the Bible. We usually think about Adam and Eve and the story about how the two came to know wisdom and knowledge and were expelled from the Garden of Eden. And since then, a lot of people have kind of claimed that Eve was the evildoer, sending off and casting off the fact that she ate from the fruit of the tree. But let's look a little deeper into what this truth is, because within inside the book of Genesis is simply something known as the Kabbalah. I'd like to let our guest kind of take it from here as she joins us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Her book is titled The Genesis Code. It's your key to unlocking the hidden genius. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Glenda Lee Hoffman. Glenda, how are you today?
Hi, thank you for inviting me. And your name is Dan?
Daniel, yes.
Daniel. Hi, Daniel.
That was part of what was in the Genesis Code, was coming up with my name. So, and early enough, I'll actually say this. From time to time, I've picked up the Bible, and looked through it. Of course, as a child, my mother made me go to church, and she said years later, because it was a particular age, very young age, she says, you really don't have to go anymore if you don't want to. But she says, the reason I had you go was that you were exposed to religion, but she says, then the rest was up to you, which I thought was actually very open-handed of her. But anyway, back to the Bible, what was interesting is, many years later I decided, what about this Daniel character that's in the book? And so I decided to go ahead and start reading about the book of Daniel, and I was astounded that this guy was a dreamer, because I've been a lucid dreamer since I was about 6 years old.
Oh.
And that got eerie. So I was telling people, I know how much sometimes people tend to beat the Bible over your head, and the evangelicals, and you name it, on and on and on. But, there's some really cool stuff in there. And obviously you discovered that from yourself through the Christ circles. Tell us how this all started for you.
That's a very long story, but I'll try to reduce it as much as possible. I had an experience when I was 5. I call it an opening. Mm-hmm. I was playing in a room by myself. There was a fire there built by my dad, and it was dying, and I wanted it back. And so I devised a way to get it back, but it backfired. And in the moment of this backfire, when I was shocked that my dream didn't come true for this nice warm fire to reignite itself, a voice very clearly spoke inside my head, and it said, "Things are not what they appear to be." Mm-hmm. Now, at 5 years old, I had absolutely no idea what to do with that kind of information. But it wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, and it was very palpable. And then, when I was 11, I left church after having gone for a year. I was looking for something. I was actually looking for an adult I could trust. I had recognized that all the adults that I knew personally, except for my grandmother, were really untrustworthy. They lied. They punished me when I didn't deserve to be punished. And so I was pretty shut down. And I was also very aware that if I couldn't find somebody who was trustworthy, I was going to grow up like all these people around me that I didn't trust, and that, to me, was agonizing. So the last place I looked for this trustworthy person was in church, and I didn't find it there, so I left. Mm-hmm. This one Sunday morning in April, walking home, it was a very, very beautiful day, sunshine outside, the butterflies and birds chirping. And all of a sudden, I found myself on this strange wooded path. I lived in a very small town. It was only about 2,500 inhabitants. So I knew the whole town by heart. And this little trek I was taking was completely unknown, and I had no idea what I was doing there. And I found this opening, and there was a man sitting on a pile of rocks, and he looked just like Jesus, and he said, "Come over here. I want to talk to you." And I was like, whoa. But I wasn't about to pass up that opportunity. So the gist of that experience was that Jesus showed me pretty much telepathically how I came to be who I was. The physical influence of DNA, of course, at that time, this was back in 1961, not very many people knew about DNA. And he didn't use the words DNA. He just used an explanation of how nature evolved all the way up to me, and that I inherited traits from all my ancestors. And then he showed me that I also inherited most of my beliefs and attitudes and values from my culture. And it was there that I realized that I'd gotten mixed up, that a lot of these beliefs and values were not based in any kind of truth. They were very arbitrary. And I wanted to talk about this to Jesus, but he said, "No, we're moving on." And he showed me that another part of me was this huge, immense ocean of potential that looked like nothing. And he said, with this potential, and he said this telepathically, you can do anything. You can change anything about yourself. You can even change your physical aptitudes if you know how to use this potential. And at that point, I realized that the reason Jesus became this powerful person was because of his ability to see this, to see life clearly, and to see how much potential we have. And so I realized if I didn't want this experience I was having, which at that time I had no idea how to process, I'd better ask Jesus some really important questions, or this experience was going to end and that would be it for me. So I said, "Please teach me to see the way you do." And he said, "Yeah." And then that was the end of it. I was standing on the sidewalk on my way home from church. And I'm 11 years old, and I've had this very deep, profound, detailed, mystical experience, but I've never heard of such a thing. I have no idea what to do with the information. I just feel glorious. And somehow my instincts told me, don't ever tell anybody about this.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't. And within a couple of years, my family moved to the Bay Area, which for me was very shocking. I had no idea how to deal with the confusion and clamor and all the social realities of living in a large urban center. And I became very lost as an adolescent, and I actually even forgot these two incidents. But later, as a young adult, at a very empty place in my life, by the time I was 23, I was already a college dropout and divorced. And I had really hit bottom, and I knew it. I was in a really, really dark place. And then I was reading a Ram Dass book, and I landed on the page that said, "When the student is ready, the teacher will be there." I just prayed that I was ready. And very quickly, through an old friend, I met these people called the Christ Circle, a group of people that met in a house led by a man named Arthur, who taught from the Bible but did nothing about what he interpreted in the Bible was traditional. And within about 3 weeks, I became very attached to this group, and I knew that I wanted to stay with them, even though I had made these other elaborate plans to go to the Grand Canyon with a friend. So very quickly after that, Arthur announced, we're going to create a community. We're going to buy a piece of property, and we're going to move in together, and we're going to create a contemplative community, so that we can study how to become enlightened and clear and expand our consciousness. So we did. We all found this 160 acres in Boulder Creek with a bunch of dormitories, and I mean, it was almost like it was built there waiting for us. Commercial kitchen with a big dining hall and a sanctuary. And we started doing meditations 2 or 3 times a day, and we had a very rigid, structured living pattern. Breakfast, dinner, and lunch were always at the same time, and the meals were planned, and somebody was in charge of laundry, and somebody was in charge of housekeeping, and we had room checks once a week. It was like living in a monastery. We were encouraged to be celibate, which I was for 4 years, but we were not limited in our scope of investigation. And one of the other people there gave me a book called The Cipher of Genesis by Carlos Suarez, and I just was very drawn to this book. And I read it several times and couldn't understand a thing about it. It was just so baffling. I couldn't put it away, but I couldn't understand it. And I just felt like I was beating my head against a wall. And I liken the experience I was having to Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan, because what Annie Sullivan was signaling into Helen's palm, Helen's attitude was the same as mine. She was just annoyed because she had no idea what Annie was doing. But what Annie was doing was stimulating Helen's brain. She was signaling over and over and over and over into Helen's brain these signals that had meaning. But Helen didn't know they had any meaning. To her, Annie was just being annoying. And so Helen, had a few fits. But then there was that breakthrough, because Helen's brain had finally created a pattern out of these meanings. And with that, I don't know if you saw the Miracle Worker, but those of us who saw the Miracle Worker saw that moment of Helen's realization that these annoying signals that Annie had been producing in her hand had meaning. They were names. And suddenly Helen's world changed. What happened in her brain is that the neural networks that had been created in response to Annie's signal all hooked up. And it was at that moment that Helen had this enormous realization that everything had a name, and that this system that Annie that she thought was annoying, was a means of communication that opened up an entire new world to Helen. And that happened with me with the Kabbalah. Mm-hmm. After studying it for 9 months and getting absolutely nowhere and being so frustrated and annoyed at it, I had this enormous breakthrough. I was driving a car down the road, going into town to do some errands for the group, and suddenly my brain just exploded like a volcano. I mean, it was so it was literally mind-blowing, and I had to pull the car to the side of the road. I couldn't think of how I might operate my body while this gigantic revolutionary insight was imploding in my brain. And what had happened is that I realized that the Kabbalah was so complicated, I would have to reduce my study to 6 letters, the very first 6 letters in the text of Genesis. So now I'll explain a little bit about the code. The way the code is hidden in Genesis is that every word that we read that appears to us as a word is actually an acronym. So it looks to us as words, but the coded aspect is that each of those words is an acronym. And in order to understand the acronym, every single letter has to be decoded according to its meaning through the Kabbalah, which uses the letters of the Hebrew alphabet not as elements of language or any type of linguistic, but as patterns of energy. And this is sort of similar to the way math uses letters like E and M, not to mean a letter or anything linguistic, but they represent M equals math, E equals energy. Similarly, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet in the Kabbalic system represent patterns of energy. And this huge opening that I had with these first 6 letters was actually, the way Carlos Suarez describes it, is called a seed of life. And to say a seed of life doesn't even begin to describe what this pattern was, this equation. But the idea is that within the seed is the whole. So a seed is like a hologram. And a seed, a real seed, is exactly how he described it. The whole is within the seed, like an oak seed, which is an acorn. Within that acorn is the whole acorn tree, the whole pattern for the acorn tree. And this seed that I saw wasn't just the seed for an acorn or an oak tree. It was the seed of life. It was the little hologram that had the entire pattern of all life in the universe in it, and it showed it to me. And I mean, at that time, I could see all the laws of quantum physics, all the laws of thermodynamics, and I could see how astronomers described that all the atoms that are created in the molecules in the cells of our body came from the explosion of stars. And that's what I saw, all of that. And I have no idea how long this vision lasted. It just came in these enormous waves of brilliant insight. And I sat there on the side of the road for, 15 minutes, half an hour. I really have no idea. And driving away was kind of like, oh, that's right, I'm still in the body. I haven't died and been blasted into smithereens in the universe somewhere and joined the stars again. I have to get on with things. But that was the moment when I realized that this code that I'd been reading about was real, and that every single time I decoded one of these equations, which appear as words, I was going to get a very similar experience. So then I was real excited and motivated. And it still took me a good long time to get deeper into this code and then to go back to Genesis and read Genesis through the lens of this code. And that's when I discovered the real story and the real truth about what is in there.
Mm-hmm. Now, first of all, let's go ahead and start with when we hear about the book of Genesis. There's the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. Tell us really what that is and what happened there from what you experienced.
So first of all, the foundational pattern of this code is wholeness. And in this foundational pattern of wholeness, the wholeness is always created by integrating opposites. And this is very visible in a seed because the two opposites that form a seed are a germ and a husk. And in the seed, the germ energy has all the growth, living energy that expands and becomes the living thing, the tree or the plant or even people. We all started as seeds. And the husk is a structural element that is static and remains the same forever until it's shattered. So when I created this lens through which to see everything through this pattern, I took another look at Genesis and realized, oh my gosh, there it is in Genesis in the two stories. The 6 days of creation is an outer story, like a husk. It's the story of our evolution, and you see it right there. And the elements of the evolution are exactly what science says. First there was the Big Bang, let there be light. Then there was the earth. This is our evolution, so it goes to earth. And the earth was without form and void. Then it was covered with water. Then the land appeared. Then plants. Then animals. Then us. That's our, big journey. That stops on the 6th day. Then the 7th day begins, and these people, the male and female that were created on the 6th day, now they're being created all over again. And now the story is very involved, and we're not talking about normal everyday things like the sun and the moon and the stars and fish in the sea and birds in the sky and days and water and land and animals and people. Now we're talking about a man created from dust and a woman created from his rib, and they can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I'm like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense as history. But looking through this lens, this is the inner element of that outer story of evolution. Oh, so now this isn't a story that happened in the past. This is the story told from inside the human psyche, those creatures that were created on the sixth day. Mm-hmm. So now all of a sudden I have this completely different perception and perspective of what this story is about. It's not about anything that happened in the past. It's about how my own brain and mind and psyche are structured to process information, the knowledge of good and evil. Well, what's good and evil? And interestingly, I found out later, after I had firmly realized that this is a story about the human psyche, not about history. This is a story of our psychology, how we learn and how we grow, and everything is in this story about what happens to us when we don't grow internally and what happens to us when we do. And then I later studied science, and everything I learned about the brain through science corroborated what I had first learned in Genesis about life and about the living elements in the human brain through awareness. And then I began to see all the elements in Genesis much more clearly. So first of all, I'll go to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Obviously, no one has ever eaten fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in real life or in history. Otherwise, either that tree went extinct, or you could find those seeds, at your local nursery and buy that tree. The use of mythology in this portion of Genesis is a signal to the reader that this is not history. Because if it were history, these would be real things, and there would be a way to discover that they actually existed. Surprisingly, the real things do exist. They just exist inside the brain and inside our awareness, because the neurons in our brain resemble trees in structure. They have an axon that resembles a trunk, and from the top of the axon, branches emerge, and from the bottom of the axon, roots emerge. And every neuron in the brain, and there are up to 100 billion, with a B, can have up to, the branches branch out until there are these little tips on the ends of the branches, and these little tips are called dendrites. And each axon can have up to 30,000 dendrites. And each one of those 30,000 dendrites connects to a dendrite from a different neural tree, and it is through these dendritic connections, which are called synapses, that all information in the brain is processed. So these trees of knowledge are the trees in our own brain that process information. And specifically in this story, they're talking about the information of good and evil. And that information is the information of duality. Mm-hmm. When I decoded the words for good and evil, I discovered something so astonishing. The breakdown of the word for good turned out to describe a pattern of static, unchanging structure. Whereas the decoding of the word for evil turned out to be this highly fertile, disruptive potential. So there again was the image of the seed, but it had been reversed. The germing aspect of these two words was defined as evil. And Carlos Suarez, in the book that I was studying, The Cipher of Genesis, his explanation for that was that disruption and fertility are perceived as evil by a static mind. And in the story, it's Adam who has the static mind, which is why he is forbidden to eat that fruit while he's alone. But as soon as his helpmate is created, and she's created for only one reason, which is to eat that fruit first, because that's exactly what she does. And when she eats it first, because she, and this is an element in the mind, in the brain, she has the ability to look beyond appearances and see into the true nature of things. And she sees that what has been assumed, the knowledge of good and evil or the knowledge of duality, is a total illusion. It's really the knowledge of wholeness, because this fruit was produced by the tree, which was generated by the seed, which carries the pattern of wholeness. It was very easy for her to see this. So she says to Adam, if you don't believe me, eat the fruit and see it for yourself. So she passes the fruit to him. He eats it. And then the interesting thing is that in the previous verses, when Adam was, and he wasn't commanded not to eat that fruit. It was simply suggested that if he did eat the fruit, he would die. But after she eats it first and gives it to him, neither of them die. A miracle happens. Their eyes are opened. It's right there in the text. So I'm looking at this through my perspective, which was started when I was 5 years old, that things are not what they appear to be. And then at 11, I asked Jesus to teach me to see. And then I encountered a Kabbalah, which teaches me how to look at this story very differently. And the story turns out to be about a woman who eats a fruit that opens her eyes. And it opens her eyes in a way that she can move beyond duality and see life in terms of wholeness. And that was what was happening to me. Mm-hmm. So each time I was deciphering these equations, which appear as words in the text, a part of my brain was reorganizing itself into a whole pattern. So that by the time I had completely finished decoding every single word in those two stories, and that's all I studied for 4 years, was Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, up to verse 16. The story of the Garden of Eden ends with Cain sitting on the east of Eden where the tree of life is. And, of course, he's completely misunderstood, too. Mm-hmm. But I realized by the time I had finished this study that this information had been hidden in plain sight in this story for 2,500 years. And people didn't realize that this was a story for us. It was a manual for how we overcome all of our conditioned thinking and train our brain to perceive life the way it actually is through patterns of wholeness instead of duality.
You know, Glenda, it's really fascinating as you lay this up for the listening audience, and I'm sure there are some people in the religious community that are going to get a little ired by what you've produced out there. And that seems reasonable. After all, you're challenging beliefs they grew up with. And that's not an easy thing for a lot of people. And it's fascinating because what you're talking about, I have actually personally had direct experience with that in the last couple of years, especially in the last year and a half, where it gets to a point in life that whether something is good or whether something is bad, you're okay either way. And it's an amazing place to really be, as you're talking about.
It is, because you realize that everything is just a lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the major lessons that I learned from Genesis was the value of disruption, because that's what, I'm sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off.
What an appropriate song, though,
huh? Yeah. The germing energies that this information taught me about are the energies of life. And they're very disruptive because they're so fertile. Fertility itself is what disrupts any static element to create more potential. And what I learned from the Kabbalah is that the whole purpose of life is to create as much potential as possible. And the words that Carlos Suarez uses to define that is all possible possibilities. So what this whole code in Genesis through these two stories, the 6 days of creation and the Garden of Eden, teach us when we really decode the deeper meaning, is that the human brain has actually achieved this enormous quality of life that all life in the universe is attempting to create. And the symbol that represents that is the number 7. And I always think it's interesting that the number 7, the actual definition for the number 7 is the achievement of the most fertility possible. So it's the achievement of all possible possibilities. And this achievement is present not just in the human brain, but in every seed. Because in every seed that's planted, whether it's a rice kernel or a walnut for a walnut tree, it will grow a plant that then produces more seeds, and every one of those seeds can be planted, and the same process occurs over and over. So no one can ever count the number of fruit that will ever be produced from one seed, because it could go on forever.
You know, Glenda, that's funny you should say that. I remember I was right around the 5th grade. My parents had brought home a peanut that you could plant and grow. And according to the instructions, when you plant this, it grows a peanut tree, which is capable of producing up to 100 more peanuts. Now, you can just imagine the childhood mind thinking, I'm going to become very wealthy because I'm going to take those 100 peanuts and I'm going to plant them, and there you go. You got 100 trees, and it just went on infinitum, you know?
Yeah,
but it's
exactly.
funny when we think that as children, which to me, I think in childhood, we're at the true nature of God's existence. And as you say in your book, and you, especially in the first 4 or 5 chapters, you talk about how we start getting conditioned to the way things are or should be, but never really the way they really are. Well, and you grow up with those biases, and I always love when people say something like, well, that's just common sense. Well, no, common sense is just the bias that you were raised with.
Yeah,
Try to use reason. That makes more sense.
Well, yeah, and what Genesis taught me was that there's this enormous difference between culture, which conditions us in our thinking, our beliefs, our attitudes, and life itself. And that was the biggest message that I came away with, that culture is, our culture even, most cultures, are very ignorant of actual life. Life itself behaves much differently than culture says it does. And, of course, this was my first message. Things are not what they appear to be. So I learned to distrust culture and trust life. That became my biggest lesson. Mm-hmm. And the way I learned to do that was to learn how to question everything that culture taught me and then wait for my own mind to absorb the information of life and reveal it to me. Mm-hmm. And that's what Genesis taught me. The whole story in Genesis is actually a manual to help your brain reorganize itself into a lens that can actually see life clearly. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens to Adam and Eve. They eat the fruit, and it opens their eyes. Mm-hmm. So, to me, this text is so incredibly valuable because it teaches us how to value disruption. And disruption, by the way, is the natural action of the germ. As soon as a seed germinates, it begins disrupting everything around it. It disrupts the soil. It disrupts right out of the soil. And then it starts growing and disrupts the atmosphere and creates new atmosphere. So everything about germing energy is disruptive, and that disruption ignites fertility. Mm-hmm. And this is the essence of life. The essence of life is to grow and produce more potential. And the human brain is so beautifully organized to do this because the human brain is capable of more change than we can even imagine. Every one of those 30,000 dendrites on all those 100 billion neurons in our brain can change. They can switch connections. And in fact, every single time we have an aha, that's exactly what has happened. A neural pathway in our brain disconnected from an old way of thinking and reconnected into a new way of thinking by reconnecting with into a different neural pathway, by connecting to different neurons. And the word Genesis, what does the word Genesis mean?
Beginning.
A new beginning
mm-hmm.
is what it actually means. A new beginning. So we, as human beings, are capable of recreating ourselves over and over and over by changing and growing. And Carlos Suarez's term for this was, what we really want to become is human beings becoming. Because that means we never settle down into any kind of static, ungrowing state. We're always growing, we're always changing. And what I learned from that is that what we're growing into is our true human persona, which turns out to be angelic in nature.
I was just thinking, Glenda, as you were describing, for instance, the disruption as the seed is germinated. Fertilized would be another way to put it as well, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm flicking through television one night several months ago, and there was a pretty rough time during that time in my life, but I just knew that if I held faith and just kept getting up each day and moving forward toward what it was I wanted, that somehow this would work out. And sometimes when we run into those disappointments, they seem to last forever until they're done. Then you look back and think, well, that wasn't that bad, and I kind of missed it. But anyway, so I'm flicking through, and I happen to go, and there's a string of religious channels, about 3 or 4 of them. And once in a while, I'll pop in, and I like to hear somebody speak. It's good to keep, pretty tight on your oration skills anyway. But what this gentleman, I sat and listened to him for almost an hour because it was fascinating what he was talking about, was very much what you're saying here. And he was talking about disappointment and discouragement. And he says, I will tell you this to be absolutely true. Disappointment is inevitable. And as much as you're saying disruption is, because there's a change occurring, okay? So perhaps you people out there who are looking for a life change, whether it's a different, better relationship, job, more money, whatever it is, you're planting the seed of hope that these changes will occur. And this also coincides with what you're saying here in the Genesis Code. And he was saying, along the way, though, as you've planted this seed and it's trying to germinate and grow, and then you're talking about this disruption, he says disappointment is going to happen. But he says, I can guarantee you that discouragement is a choice. Now you have to decide what you're going to do at this point here. And that's a lot of exactly what you're talking about as well.
Well, I love the way you explained that, because what I learned from Genesis and from the code is that change has this pattern, and the pattern is that what did you call it? Not discouragement, but the other word?
Disappointment?
Disappointment. The disappointment and the discouragement, those are like the husk.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to be shattered by the germ. And I used to have these experiences that I called pressure globes, because when we plant that seed of hope, which means we want to change, we're telling our psyche that we want to move on. Well, there are parts of the psyche that doesn't want to move on. There are parts of the psyche that want to remain static.
We've actually talked, Glenda, on the program many times about, neurobiology, and there's a specific scientific reason why that is, but go ahead and continue.
Yeah, well, and I have my own explanation for that. But the point is, the pattern of growth is that each one of those husks, whether you call them disappointment or discouragement or whatever, the depression that you reach when you think that your hopes are not going to be attained, those are simply the husks that you have to shatter and move through. And all change involves this pattern of planting the seed of hope or intention, whatever word you want to use. You don't even have to know what it is. You don't even have to be able to articulate it in words. You just have to want it. Because I know that's how I started. I couldn't even put words into what I wanted. I just wanted it. I knew it wasn't what I had. That's what I knew. And I used to say, I don't know where I'm going, but I sure know where I've been, and I ain't going back there. So you don't even have to be able to articulate what it is you really want. You just have to want it. You have to want something better than you have now. And by this, I mean an internal state of mind. And then you will hit that ceiling. You will hit that despair, that discouragement. But if you hold on to the original intention, you will eventually shatter that. Not only that, but you'll have to go through that process over and over and over until it becomes so natural that you're able to see it coming down the road. I used to say, oh, there it is. It's coming around the corner. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be really depressed. And then, oh, it's come around the corner. It's knocking at my front door. Oh, geez, look at it. It walked in and knocked me flat.
Mm-hmm.
And once I got to that place, I realized, you know what? This pattern is going to go over and over and over and over. I might as well just completely surrender. I asked for this. And when you come to that place, then, just like you said, there is no good or bad, because you've learned how to swim in the waters of life, and you're just allowing the current to take you along. And you've just given up all resistance to any of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes this continual process of expanding awareness and expanding consciousness. And what happens with that, what happened to me anyway, is I got healthier. I learned how to design my life so that it was much less stressful. I learned how to target the problems in my marriage and solve them so that my marriage became this wonderful relationship, which I now tell people, hey, I live in heaven. That's what my marriage feels like.
You like apples, like the ones in the Garden of Eden? How you like them apples?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you have a wonderful relationship, everything in your life takes second place. It doesn't matter what happens otherwise, because your relationship is so good and so solid that you're continually renewed by it. So I've reached a place in my life where I live in heaven. Mm-hmm. It's right here. I get to experience every minute. Sure, I have annoying moments, but they are so fleeting, and they last for 5 minutes, and then I'm back to being in heaven again. It's like, it's wonderful. Mm-hmm. And I started out just like everybody else, so confused and in such darkness. I can remember that I was in darkness, but I can't remember how it feels anymore.
I was curious because I'm looking at the cover of your book, and it's going back to the idea of Genesis and the symbolisms they have there. And on the cover you have a serpent, and you have an apple, and you have a hand.
A woman's hand.
A woman's hand, excuse me, and you're right about that. And that is very important to know. But let's talk about, for instance, the significance of the serpent, because there's a lot of times it's been interpreted as the one that spoke the evil or something like that. And I don't pretend to know a whole lot about Genesis outside of, again, culturally and conditionally what I've learned or what I've learned through reading, sometimes through the back door. But there were times that I would read that the serpent was tremendously significant in wisdom. Now, kind of give us a little eye-opener on that one.
Okay, so after I learned to reinterpret Genesis, I then started studying the brain. And what I found about the brain matched almost exactly what I had read in Genesis. I was astonished. First of all, the main thing I learned, I started studying through a correspondence with a man named Dr. Paul MacLean, who was then, this is the early 80s, he was the head of the Department of Brain Evolution at the National Institutes of Mental Health. I read an article about him in a science magazine, and literally, I read it one night, I went to bed, I woke up the next morning, leaped out of bed, and furiously wrote down this poem that just was roaring through my mind. And it was all about this article that I had, the information that I had read in this article about what he termed the triune brain. And how he explained it was that the human brain mirrors terrestrial evolution in that we have a reptilian cortex, an early mammalian cortex, and a human cortex. And then the human cortex, he said, is divided into two portions, an earlier human cortex and a later human cortex. And I learned to reinterpret his information as a little bit distorted there because I now see it as a quadriune brain. We have a reptilian cortex, a mammalian cortex, a hominid cortex, and a human cortex. So what that means is that there's only one part of the brain that's human. And it's the part that sits right behind the forehead. It's called the frontal lobe, or the prefrontal cortex. That is the only, and this can be verified by paleontologists and by just looking at the skulls of all the hominids that came before us. A lot of scientists are still a little bit confused about this. They want to define humans as beginning with bipedalism.
Right.
And the neocortex. But bipedalism emerged with hominids, not humans. We didn't become fully human until we got that frontal lobe. And that frontal lobe is what gave us all the qualities of what we think of as uniquely human. So the only distinguishing factor between humans and hominids, the latest hominids, is this large frontal lobe that we have. And it turns out that the frontal lobe is the only part of the brain that processes all personal and social awareness, as well as all our intentions to be better, and a lot of other things besides that. But that's the major thing. So here's the human brain. It has a reptilian cortex. So what's a snake?
Well, it's a predator.
It's a reptile.
Mm-hmm.
So you got a snake in Genesis talking to Eve, who is the frontal lobe. So Eve's the frontal lobe, Adam is the neocortex, which is the hominid brain, and the serpent is the reptilian cortex. Now, just so happens that the reptilian cortex has the most powerful neurochemistry in the brain. And that neurochemistry is fear. And it also has another neurochemistry which we think of as willpower. And willpower is a neurochemistry that is based in norepinephrine and energizing chemicals that give us the motivation to not only to survive, but to grow. So you have the reptilian cortex, represented by the snake, talking to the frontal lobe, saying, and this is what he actually says in the text, if you want to be wise, you will eat that fruit. And she says, well, I want to be wise. That's exactly what, I'm not reading it word for word because I don't have the Bible in front of me, but that's what he says to her. He doesn't say anything evil. He says, if you want to be wise. And then there are references to the tree as being good for food and pleasant to the sight. Now, the reference to food, I realized, is that how the brain processes information, and we call it food for thought, is similar to the way the body digests food. Because how the brain processes information is that it breaks it down into bits, and then it reformulates it into ideas. So when the serpent refers to this wisdom and the fruit of this tree as being good for food and pleasant to the sight, he's also referring to the aspects of the frontal lobe. And now I'm going to define the different ways that the frontal lobe and the neocortex operate. The neocortex, which is the hominid cortex, can only look outward to the outer world. It has no capacity at all to look inward to the inner world and assess how the brain is processing information. It can only look to the outer world. And this is the part of the brain that developed along with bipedalism that gave us a specific perspective of creating a right triangle with bipedal posture. So we stand on the earth at a 90-degree angle, which creates a right triangle. And it's one of the reasons that we use the word right to mean correct, especially in terms of right and wrong. It's that kind of thinking comes through the neocortex, and it's all based on our bipedal posture. I read a whole dissertation on this, and it was fascinating. Mm-hmm. The frontal lobe, on the other hand, can only look inward. And, of course, this is why it's the frontal lobe that processes all personal and social awareness, because that awareness only occurs inside the brain. It doesn't occur by looking outward. It occurs by how we assess what we see outward. So, in the story of the Garden of Eden are all these elements that are part of the brain. And the way we become fully human is by fertilizing all the potential elements in the frontal lobe. Because if we do that, the frontal lobe will grow new neural networks that reconnect the older evolutionary parts of the brain and bring them under the agenda of the frontal lobe. What we have now in the world is the chaos that is represented by a brain that is not in control of itself, because the agendas of the reptilian, mammalian, and hominid cortex are hijacking the human agenda of the frontal lobe because they're bigger and more powerful. Mm-hmm. In order to become fully human, we have to activate the frontal lobe, and we do that through our hopes and our intentions to become a better person.
Mm-hmm. I think you might agree with me on this, and that is our educational institutions do a great job of beating that back.
They do.
You know, and
unfortunately.
One of the things, that I remember growing up with is that, I was one of those kids that just couldn't sit still, and eventually in like 3rd and 4th grade I was actually sent home at lunch. We couldn't handle this kid anymore. I didn't think I was that bad, but anyway, what I would constantly hear, and I know a lot of people out there heard the same thing when the parents met with the teachers. Well, I know your son or your daughter is intelligent, but they're just not working up to their full potential. Now, my mother never finished high school, And she had the audacity one time to look square in the teacher's eyes when this teacher said this and said, "Do you believe you worked up to your full potential?" And that was the end of that.
you lucky guy to have a mother like that.
Here's an even funnier story, because every time I think of Adam and Evil, I think about my mother, who at one time, I don't know where she is now, but she had proclaimed she was an atheist, and she had good reason, at least according to her, why she didn't believe God exists. Well, it seems unfair that that animals would go to hell, as she would say, because they don't know the difference between sin and good. They don't know that. So she had her reasons why, but I don't know where she is with it now. But that subject of Adam and Eve and eating from the tree, the fruit from the tree came up. And she says, I don't know why they're picking on Eve for. She picked up and she just handed Adam the apple, and he was stupid enough to eat it. And that's all. Every time I think of Adam and Eve, I think of that moment where she put herself in a position where Eve was the smart one. She picked the apple and handed it to this dummy over here who decided to go ahead and eat it. So she turned that one around.
Well, for an uneducated woman, she's pretty dang smart. And I want to say this too. Not only is our educational system very static, but most institutions in society are very static.
Oh, yes.
They're very reptilian because
they spend time protecting themselves.
That's all they do. Right. Now, there are some that aren't. There are some companies out there that really are invested in not only the growth of their own company in a dynamic way that actually goes along with life's patterns, but they encourage their employees to do the same thing. And Google might be one of them. I'm not sure. I don't know everything about Google.
Right.
But they've certainly demonstrated an ability to change and move with patterns that come along. And, of course, their CEOs are very young. More than most institutions. But we happen to live in a society. And this is the, kind of the nature of the beast when it comes to institutions. By the time a company has become an institution, it really has become static. And its only activity then is to invest in protecting itself. And, of course, that is the function of the husk. The husk is this protective element. Now, there's nothing wrong with a husk. What's wrong is if you're going to remain a husk, if you're never going to germinate that hidden potential in the germ. The point that I learned in Genesis is that the husk and germ always work together, or they don't work at all. So the point of, especially of us as human beings with this incredible brain that we have, is to continue to change forever. And Carlos Suarez defined this as not only human beings becoming, but he said, if you do this, what you will become is a container of essences. Now, to me, that is such beautiful poetry, because I've discovered that as I change, I distill knowledge, and it becomes these pearls of wisdom. And I've learned to let go of all the superfluous parts of the information and keep only that pearl of wisdom. So I feel like now that I've attained this state in life where I just thoroughly enjoy every minute, I feel like in my mind is this little golden bag of pearls that I draw on for my enjoyment.
Linda, this has been a fast hour, an amazing hour. I'd like to welcome the opportunity to have you back on our program, again, to expound further on the genius side. I know we dealt mostly with the symbolism, but you brought it together marvelously, I thought, for our listeners to understand, what's really going on here. But within the last minute here, go ahead and give our listeners out your website where they can find out more about this and any closing thought you may have about all that.
Well, Daniel, it's been wonderful talking to you, too, and I'd love to come back anytime. As you can tell, this is my favorite subject, and I can talk for hours.
And people will want to listen because you talk very well.
Well, thank you. My website is www.thegenesiscode.com. You can buy my book there. You can also buy it on Amazon, and it's also available in Kindle. I also have a free booklet titled 7 Techniques to Cultivate Your Genius. Mm-hmm. And all you have to do is put your email in the little slot there, and I will send it to you. And I will answer anybody's email who has any questions. I love to correspond with people who are on their path of growth.
Very good. Glenda, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. What a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Daniel. You're a fabulous host.
Thank you. Well, you just plant those seeds and you just go where they take you. We'll be in touch, definitely. The book is The Genesis Code. It's your key to unlocking hidden genius. Our guest today, Glenda Lee Hoffman. We'll have a hot link on our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Find out more about that, as we also offer our wonderful exclusive updates for our listeners. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.